Imagine setting up your tent deep in the Appalachian Mountains. No signal, no people, just you and the trees. But then, something moves just beyond the firelight. A breath you didn't take. A sound that doesn't belong. In this video, we're diving into 10 of the most disturbing true camping horror stories from the Appalachian wilderness. Tales shared by real hikers, campers, and survivors who still don't have answers. If you're a fan of chilling true stories, tap like. So this video reaches more horror lovers like you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Every viewer is part of my horror family, and I want to know where my family's tuning in from. And as always, let me know which story creeped you out the most. Hit subscribe to support Creepy Souls. It helps more than you know. And lets us keep bringing you terrifying tales from the dark corners of the world. I'm not new to the woods. I grew up just south of Boone, and I've been solo camping since I was 17, mostly off marked trails, where the ground is soft and quiet and the forest doesn't feel staged for tourists. For me, it's how I reset, how I get out of my head when the walls at home start feeling too close. This time, I took 3 days off work and drove east toward Roan Mountain, that stretch along the North Carolina-Tennessee line where the fog always seems to hang just a little longer, where the creek trails don't have names, just switchbacks and old forest roads that lead to nowhere in particular. I parked where the gravel turned to mud, loaded my pack, and hiked for maybe 4 hours until I found a decent clearing just above a bend in the creek. There was a slight slope, but it was dry, and you could hear the water from camp, not rushing, but steady like breathing. I set up my tarp, started a small fire, and boiled some coffee just as dusk came down through the trees like mist. The air smelled like rot and pine needles, faint smoke and moss. Nothing unusual. What was unusual, and I noticed this just before night fully settled, was how quiet it had gotten. No insects, no frogs. Even the creek seemed a little muted. I told myself the air pressure must have dropped or something, but I still felt it, that empty kind of quiet that wraps around your ribs like something's waiting. It was around 11:30. When I saw him, I'd just fed the fire a few branches and was about to climb into my bag when I noticed movement, directly across the fire, maybe 10 feet away, just at the edge of the ring of light. A man. He was sitting cross-legged on the ground, perfectly still, facing me. I didn't hear him walk up, didn't see a light. His clothes were soaked like he'd come straight out of the creek. His hair hung down in wet strings plastered to his forehead. I didn't say anything at first. I just froze. I think I even held my breath. I picked up my flashlight, aimed it toward him, and clicked it on. Nothing. Just mud, wet leaves, and the tree line. No footprints. No man. I stood up, walked around the fire, and nothing. Not even disturbed ground. The soil was soft there, sloped gently toward the creek. If someone had been sitting, there'd be an impression. I waited a while, listened. But all I could hear was the fire crackling and the occasional drip of condensation falling off the tarp. I told myself maybe I'd dozed off. Maybe I'd imagined it. I've had dreams that bled into wakefulness before, vivid, especially out here alone. I doused the fire, climbed into my bag, listened to the creek for a long time before sleep took over. But somewhere around 2 a.m. I felt it again. That presence. I opened my eyes. There was a dim red glow from the embers and barely enough to see by, but he was there. Again, sitting cross-legged in the same spot, closer this time, maybe 6 feet from the ashes. I didn't turn on the flashlight. I just stared, and he stared back. No expression, no motion, just soaking wet, head slightly tilted. I lit the fire again, fast. I had kindling ready, and just like before, gone. This time I didn't sleep. The next morning everything looked ordinary. Sunlight filtering through the branches, damp ground steaming slightly as the light warmed it. I searched the whole area. No signs, no tracks. I found myself second-guessing. Maybe some kind of waking dream. Maybe dehydration. I hadn't eaten much the day before. Maybe the firelight played tricks. But then I found something. Near the edge of the creek, about 15 feet downhill from my tarp, there was a patch of darker mud, more compacted. I squatted down. It was the shape that got me. Not footprints exactly, but knees. Knees and ankles, spaced exactly how someone might sit cross-legged. Deep, too. Not recent. They'd been rained on. Maybe a day or two old. Still, I stayed. Part of me didn't want to seem afraid of my own imagination. I stayed close to camp that day, collected more wood, tried to journal it out. But I couldn't shake the image of him, those eyes not looking through me but at me, like he was waiting for something I hadn't realized yet. That night I made sure the fire stayed big. I cooked a real meal, rice and tuna, and forced myself to eat every bite. I left the flashlight in my lap. Midnight came and went. No sign. But around 1:45 a.m., I heard a sound that turned my gut cold, splashing, upstream, slow, methodical steps through water. It was coming toward my camp. I stood up, turned the flashlight toward the sound, but I couldn't see past the first bend in the creek. The splashing stopped, then silence. I waited. Minutes passed. The fire popped and hissed, but I couldn't hear anything else. No wind, no night sounds, and then, behind me, a soft squelch. I spun around. He was standing this time. Not sitting. Right at the edge of the light, just beyond where the fire could fully reach, soaked from the neck down. Hands at his sides. Face blank, I didn't speak. I didn't move. Just stared. Then I did something I don't fully understand even now. I sat down, cross-legged. He didn't react, but something in his shoulders relaxed just slightly, almost like relief, and then he turned. Walked into the dark, no sound. Not even the leaves. I didn't sleep. I didn't even blink much. I kept the fire burning until dawn, then packed up fast and left without eating. I didn't even bother to clean the site, but here's the part I don't talk about. Back home, I washed my gear in the tub. When I shook out my sleeping bag, something small and waterlogged thudded onto the tile. A matchbox. It wasn't mine. Inside were 3 matches, still dry. On the back, scribbled in faded ink, "He only comes when the fire goes out." I haven't camped alone since, and I never, ever let the fire die. I wasn't looking for anything dramatic, just solitude, some space to think, a breakup, a job I hated, and the growing sense that I'd somehow drifted away from myself had left me raw. I didn't want people. I didn't want answers. I just wanted quiet, so I packed up my gear, drove past hot springs and parked near Mac's Patch, a bald mountaintop straddling the Tennessee-North Carolina line. Most folks camp near the summit. I didn't. I took an old forest access road that led down into the pines where the ground stayed soft and the wind got trapped between the trees. I hiked for a couple miles till I found a flat patch of earth above a small creek bed, ringed by red spruce and white pine. It smelled damp, earthy, like wet stone and broken bark. I pitched the tent before dusk, boiled some beans and rice, and sat by the fire until the wind picked up. Nothing heavy, just the kind of breeze that makes the trees sound like they're whispering things you can't quite catch. Crawled into the tent around 10:30. The rain didn't come until maybe 3 a.m. I'd been half asleep, listening to the creek murmur through the dark when the wind shifted. The rain hit fast in sheets. I sat up, zipped the window shut, and waited it out. The thunder stayed distant, but something else replaced it. Footsteps. Heavy ones, soft at first. A few cautious presses into the mud and pine needles just outside the tent. I froze, thinking bear. Black bears are common up here. I'd stored my food in a dry bag 20 yards off, hung between 2 trees like always. But still, the noise. It was deliberate. Whatever it was paced around the tent, circling once, then again. Each step squished slightly in the wet ground, close enough that I could feel the vibration of it through my foam pad. Then it stopped. Right outside the door flap, and I heard it breathe, slow, ragged, not the snorting kind of exhale bears make. Not the sniffing, animalistic huffs I've heard before on trail cams. This was different. It was low, strained, like someone trying not to cough. It didn't move, didn't growl, didn't sniff, just breathed. I didn't dare move. I didn't even swallow. I kept one hand clutched around my knife handle and the other near the zipper, though I wasn't sure what I'd do with either. It went on for over 30 minutes, not constantly. It would stop, then start again, sometimes shifting just slightly. I could hear pine needles crumple softly, like pressure shifting from one foot to another. At some point it rained harder, and I realized I couldn't hear the breathing anymore, but I didn't move, I didn't sleep. I just waited for daylight. When it came, pale and gray, with a low mist creeping in through the trees, I finally unzipped the tent. There were no footprints, just flattened pine needles in a half circle around the tent, and scratched into the tree beside me. Not carved, just scratched deep and frantic, and were 2 words. I waited. I didn't say anything. Not out loud. I didn't even feel scared, not in the way you'd expect. I just felt watched. I should have packed up and left. Any rational person would have. But something held me there. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe pride. Maybe something quieter. The part of you that needs things to make sense before you can move on. I spent most of the morning circling the site. No broken branches. No claw marks. The dirt was too wet to hold prints, but I did find one thing. A strange patch behind the tent where the pine needles had been. Cleared, not scattered or blown away. Cleared, like someone had sat there for a long time. The bark on the closest spruce had shallow grooves, long fingernail-type scrapes that didn't pierce deep, but ran in parallel lines down to the base. I kept trying to explain it to myself. Maybe a hiker passing through. Maybe a prank. But who would be hiking down that slope during a storm in the dark without light or shelter? And why not just call out? I stayed a second night, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to know if it would come back. I built the fire bigger, moved my tent slightly toward the creek. I kept the flashlight in my hand, my boots on, my pack half zipped. The rain returned around 1 a.m., this time lighter, a steady hiss against the nylon. At 2:30, I heard something upstream, a single splash, then another. Too heavy for an animal, too irregular for flowing water, something waiting. I sat up, unzipped the tent an inch, shined the flashlight toward the creek. Nothing, just fog and silver droplets on the branches, but the breathing returned, not beside the tent, behind it. No footsteps this time, just breathing, shallow, wet. I didn't turn. I don't know why. I just lay back down. Not out of courage. Not fear either. It was more like resignation. The way you lie still when you know something's already chosen you. I didn't sleep. At dawn, the breathing was gone. The fog was thick and scratched into the bark of the same spruce. A few inches below the first message was something new. Why did you move? That was 3 years ago. I don't hike solo anymore. Not in the Appalachians. Not near Max Patch. And I don't camp in the rain. Because every time I hear it, that quiet hush against the roof of a car or a cabin, I still wonder if I'll hear it again, that breath just outside the light waiting. It was supposed to be a 3-day loop. Me and my buddy Casey had planned it months in advance. An off-grid backpacking route through a lesser-known section of trail off Klingman's Dome. Casey found it in a forum. Old switchbacks that dropped down into the hollows west of the dome, near some abandoned Forest Service roads that had long since been swallowed up by treefall and undergrowth. We weren't idiots. We had maps, GPS, printed terrain overlays, and backups. We wanted quiet, not danger, and we got it. More than I think either of us expected. We parked near Forney Ridge before sunrise, hiked the first 10 miles with no trouble. The air was wet, heavy with pine and rot. Morning fog clung to the tree trunks like smoke. Somewhere around mile 7, we left the established trail, cut eastward through a stretch of old growth until we found the faint markers of the forgotten loop. Subtle red slashes on bark, faded to near invisibility. By the second night, we'd dropped down into a hollow so deep the sun barely touched it even at noon. The silence was thick. Not dead, but waiting. No birds, no frogs. Just the sound of our boots in the mud and the occasional creak of trees shifting in the windless dark. It was on day 3 that we noticed the first thing. We passed a twisted hemlock, massive, easily 4 feet thick, bent sideways like it had been half pulled from the earth and then left to freeze in that shape. I remember pointing it out because it looked like something out of a nightmare, but we shrugged it off. The mountains are full of strange things, especially this deep in. An hour later, we passed it again. Same shape, same angle, same patch of lichen peeled back where the bark had split. At first, we thought it was just a similar tree, but then we saw the old metal marker on the nearby stump, a rusted-out tin square with a nail bent clean through. Casey had made a joke about it the first time. We stopped. Checked our map. Our GPS said we were still moving forward, hadn't doubled back. But terrain doesn't lie. We were looping, we camped early that night. Neither of us said it out loud, but I think we both felt it. That creeping tension behind your ribs when something doesn't line up. When you know it doesn't make sense, but every logical part of you is trying to explain it away. We barely slept. By midday on day 4, the fog had thickened to the point you couldn't see more than 30 feet ahead. Everything smelled like wet stone and cold smoke. That's when we saw the van, a rusted-out hulk, sunken deep into the earth off to the right of the trail. Trees had grown through the frame. No wheels, no doors, just a carcass. We were stunned. Not because it was there. People abandoned things in the woods all the time, but because we'd already seen it 2 days earlier. That exact van, I remember the burn pattern on the roof, the way the windshield glass had melted into the ground. We'd commented on it, joked about who had driven it out here, but now it felt different, familiar in a way that pressed down hard on my chest. Casey walked up to it first, shined his flashlight into the dark shell of the interior, and that's when we saw them, Polaroid photos, pinned to the rotted dashboard with a rusted nail. Maybe a dozen of them, each one was of us, from this trip. I could see the red patch on Casey's jacket sleeve. The mug I'd been using clipped to the outside of my pack. Shots of us sitting near the fire, one of me tying my bootlaces, one of Casey standing with his back to the tent, looking up into the trees. We never brought a Polaroid camera. We never took these. I didn't say anything. Neither did he. The fog swallowed our voices anyway. We didn't camp that night. We walked. Didn't matter that the light was fading. Didn't matter that the map said we were 20 miles from the trailhead. We just moved, trying to follow our compass, trying to break the loop. But no matter which direction we picked, the terrain folded in on itself. We passed the twisted hemlock again just before dusk. Casey sat down and started rubbing his face like he was trying to wake up. I kept moving. At some point, the trail stopped. Not faded, stopped. Like the forest had never meant for us to be here in the first place. I found a small clearing. Not a campsite, just a flattened patch of ground with stone on 3 sides. I called Casey over. He didn't answer at first, just stared off into the fog like he was watching something move. Eventually he came. We sat back to back, no fire, barely speaking. The temperature dropped fast. Everything smelled like old leaves and stagnant water. I didn't sleep. At some point after midnight, I thought I saw a light moving between the trees, faint and bluish like a phone screen or headlamp. But when I blinked, it was gone. Casey didn't mention it, but in the morning he was different, quiet, pale. He told me he'd seen something in the trees, not a person. Just a shape. Watching. I didn't ask. We found the van again around noon, same burn pattern, same sunken shell, but the photos were gone. In their place, inside the van's metal frame, was a single object. My pack. The same mug. Same jacket. Even the granola bar I knew I hadn't eaten yet. Everything arranged neatly on the floorboard. I turned to Casey, my throat bone dry, his face was blank. Still, he just said, "We need to leave." That was 2 years ago. We made it out the next day. Stumbled into a gravel lot near the main Klingman's Dome access road. Our phones reconnected. The time, the date, everything checked out. It had only been 4 days. We don't talk much anymore. I moved to Asheville. Got out of the hiking scene entirely. Casey drifted off. Last I heard, he stopped sleeping indoors. Said he feels safer outside. I still have the Polaroids. I didn't take them, but they're real. The same red patch on his jacket. The same look on my face. Confused, tired, looking past the camera like I was hearing something just out of frame. I don't show them to anyone. I don't even look at them anymore, but sometimes, if the wind hits right, especially in the early morning when fog clings low to the ground, I remember that sound. Not footsteps, not voices, just the quiet hum of something watching, waiting for you to notice it's already seen you. I wasn't raised outdoorsy, but my buddy Reed grew up in southern West Virginia, deep in coal country, and knew these mountains better than most people know their own driveways. He'd talk about hollers and ridgelines and logging roads like they were living things. Said the best cure for a loud mind was a quiet hollow. After a hard winter and a worse breakup, I took him up on that. We packed light, no guns, no GPS, just topographic maps, 2 old packs, and a rented Subaru that barely made it through the switchback south of Welch. Reed had heard about a viewpoint camp a little east of Panther Lick, just above a hollow with no roads, no structures. Nothing but trees and fog. He called it untouched. It took most of the afternoon to bushwhack up there. The trail disappeared quick. The air smelled thick with moss and loam, that damp Appalachian smell of rot and pine and wet stone. Everything felt soft underfoot, like the ground had been soaking up rain for months. We set up camp on a flat shoulder just above the drop. The ridge sloped hard down into the hollow, too steep to climb easily. I remember kneeling to filter water and seeing nothing but tree canopy below, all swaying in the wind like slow, sleepy breathing. We ate dinner just as the sky turned the kind of gray that means rain's coming soon. The fog crept up from the valley before dark even settled. Then, just after 9 here, we heard the first scream. It came from below, somewhere in the hollow. High-pitched, human. Not an animal yelp. Not a coyote or bobcat or owl. It was someone begging. A woman maybe had cut through the trees, sharp and urgent. Then silence. Reed and I locked eyes. We waited. Another scream came, further off this time, or maybe just muffled by fog. Echo, Reed muttered, but he didn't sound sure. We stood at the edge of the slope, listening. There were no lights, no trails, no cabins below as we checked the maps. But the scream came again, and again, always moving but never closer. Sometimes it sounded like two voices overlapping, like a delay on bad speakers, a half-second behind itself. I wanted to believe someone was down there, that we could hike down and help, but the slope was dangerous. Loose shale and roots made it almost vertical in places. We stayed put, sat by the fire, neither of us speaking. The screams came every 10 or 15 minutes until midnight. Then nothing, only the fog pressing in, thick and wet and sour smelling. I didn't sleep much. The silence somehow felt louder than the screams had. And around 3 a.m. I thought I heard whispering just outside the tent. Not words, just a sound, breathy and close, like someone breathing out syllables they didn't want to say. We didn't say much that morning. Reed made coffee like normal, but neither of us mentioned the screaming. Not directly. When I asked what he thought it was, he just shook his head and said, "Sound bounces strange in places like this." But that didn't explain what we found later. We decided to hike a wider loop that morning. Circle north and connect with the old fire road near War Ridge. Around mid-morning, the trail leveled out through a patch of birch and dogwood, where the fog lifted just long enough to see down into the hollow. And there, maybe 300 feet below, we saw a small clearing. Not natural. There was something man-made, a collapsed structure. Maybe a hunting shack or a ranger post from decades ago. Rusted metal sheets, dark wood, and what looked like a burned-out frame. Reed checked the map again. No markings, no trails. But the air shifted when we spotted it, a sour metallic tang like rust and wet ash. We didn't climb down. The slope was too steep. But I marked the coordinates on my phone anyway, even though I had no signal. The rest of the hike was quiet. No screams. We made it to the fire road by late afternoon and hitched a ride back to our car from a Ranger in a dented pickup with a cracked dashboard and a quiet, tired face. When Reed asked about the hollow near Panther Lick, the Ranger didn't react much, just kept driving. Then he said something I haven't stopped thinking about. "Don't camp downwind of that hollow," he said. "Some places carry sound different." Reed asked if he meant echoes. The Ranger was quiet for a few seconds, then he said, "Some voices echo longer than they should." He dropped us off at the gravel pull-off without another word. I never saw him again. Back home, I couldn't stop thinking about the shack. I did some digging, local history forums, scanned newspapers, coal maps, anything. What I found wasn't much. Just a single comment on an old hiking message board from 2009, "Avoid Panther Lick Hollow." Used to be a homestead or something. Fire took it out. Locals said they heard someone calling for help years after. Might have been a squatter, might have been nothing. Either way, don't sleep downwind. I still have that screenshot. I haven't been back to the Appalachians since. Sometimes, when I'm walking at night or sitting in bed and the wind is just right, I swear I hear it again, and that voice, pleading, not loud, not clear but still there, like whatever it is down there never got found, or maybe never really left. I wasn't the outdoors type, not really. But a year ago I said yes to a weekend trip with my cousin Tyler and his friend Josh, two guys who treated camping like church. They promised we'd stay off the beaten path, someplace near the Bald Mountains east of Irwin, Tennessee, but high enough in elevation that you could hear nothing but the wind and your own heart. We drove deep into Pisgah, past the marked trails and parked on an old logging road barely wide enough for the truck. From there, it was a steep mile hike to a ridgeline overlooking a hollow thick with pine, oak, and rot. The air smelled clean at first, dry bark, faint honeysuckle, but the further down we went, the heavier it got, like damp towels and old leaves. We set up camp on a narrow rise. Tent staked solid, tarp overhead, fire ring cleared. You couldn't see more than 30 yards in any direction, just wall-to-wall green, wet with recent rain. The forest was loud with insects and birds, but somehow felt closed off, like a room with no windows. That first night was quiet, uneventful mostly. We drank cheap bourbon out of metal cups and passed a Bluetooth speaker around. Talked about nothing. Laughed. The way you do when you're trying to forget work and whatever else you left back home. I went to sleep around midnight. The others stayed up, still whispering by the fire. What happened next? I didn't imagine it. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the tent shifting. Not just rustling from the wind and pulling, like something had latched on and was dragging the whole thing downhill, tarp and all. My pad slid under me. I heard Tyler yell. The tent tilted. My foot hit Josh's pack. I tried to unzip the flap, but the whole thing was jerking sideways. It sounded like something wet was scraping along the rainfly. We scrambled for knives and headlamps. Tyler's voice cracked when he shouted. I remember that. When we finally got the zipper down and poured out into the fog, the forest was dead quiet. No movement, no wind, no animal sounds. Just our breathing and the beam of Tyler's light sweeping across the ridge. And then we saw it. A vine, thick and green, freshly cut, looped in a perfect knot around the front right tent pole. Not just tangled, tied. Pulled taut like someone had meant to drag us. The vine stretched off into the trees, disappearing into the underbrush. And there were more. 3 others, coiled near trees, perfectly knotted, ends cut clean. All set and waiting. None of us had done it, and none of us said that we had. I walked the line of the vine maybe 20 feet before it disappeared behind a rotted stump. It smelled freshly snapped, that sharp green smell like crushed weeds. But the knot, it was too clean, too intentional. Josh said it looked like a bowline, something his grandfather used when he taught him to tie boats, a fixed loop. Hard to untie unless you know how. We didn't sleep. We packed up in silence just before dawn and sat by the fire till light came. Nobody suggested we leave early, but none of us stayed behind when we did. We hiked out slow, trying not to admit we were spooked. Tyler said maybe someone was out there playing a joke, some old hunter or squatter who wanted us off that land. But the look in his eyes didn't match his voice. Josh didn't speak at all for the first half hour. We followed the ridge north, trying to hit the same route back to the truck. But the woods felt unfamiliar. I'd marked a downed oak with orange tape the day before. It was gone. Instead, we passed a small clearing that none of us remembered. Soft ground, scattered with clumps of cut vines. Each with ends too clean to be natural, and something else. A series of shallow impressions in the mud. Not footprints, just indentations, the width of a boot maybe, but spaced wrong, too wide apart, and only the balls of the prints remained. No heel marks. Like someone crouched and walked low, barely touching ground. Tyler squatted to look closer, didn't speak, just stared. It started raining around noon, light at first, then steady. By the time we made it back to the truck, our packs were soaked through. When we pulled out of the hollow, I turned once more to look through the fog. And I swear, at the edge of the woods where we'd parked, there was a knot of vine hanging from a pine branch. Just one, dangling. I didn't tell the others. Back home, I kept thinking about the knots. I started looking them up. Variations of bowlines, half hitches, slip knots, sailor's knots. The one from the tent wasn't decorative. It was functional, meant to bear weight, designed not to slip. A week passed. Then 2. Then one afternoon, I came home from work and found a bundle of green cordage tucked against my front door. Not a package. No label, just vines. Dried now, coiled in the same knot. No one else had a key to my place. No one else even knew that part of the story. I threw them out, but I didn't sleep that night. A month later, Tyler moved back to Kentucky, said he was done with camping. Josh deleted all his trail apps and stopped answering texts altogether. I heard he sold his gear. Told a mutual friend that sleeping indoors felt safer. I still hike. but only in open spaces. No ridgelines, no hollows, nothing with tree cover thick enough to feel like a ceiling, and I never camp without checking the ground. Not just for rocks, but for anything tied, anything pulled tight, because I still don't know who did it or why. But I know this much. Those knots weren't meant to hold something, they were meant to drag. I'd been trying to get off-grid for a few days. Just unplug, be alone with my thoughts. I'm not the type who does well in cities. And after everything that happened last winter, the panic attacks, the job loss, the months in that small apartment with no windows that opened, I just needed air. I picked a spot a few miles outside of Boone, North Carolina. Not the usual trailheads. I found an old fire service road that cut along a ridge near Blowing Rock and drove until the gravel turned to mud and the brush started clawing at my mirrors. I pulled off where the road turned too narrow to trust, parked beside a fallen pine, and hiked in about a mile through shoulder-high ferns and damp forest. The air smelled like wet moss and burned wood. Not fresh. Like an old campfire that never quite went out. I set up camp in a narrow clearing, maybe 20 feet across, lined by thin white birch trees that rose straight and quiet on both sides like fence posts. It was one of those Appalachian spots where everything feels old. Not haunted, just worn in. The first night was uneventful. Rain came and went, just a light misting. I didn't sleep great, but I rarely do in the woods. Every snapping branch pulls me halfway to consciousness. Still, it was what I needed. No signal, no screens. Just the drip of water on tarp and the steady breath of the trees. On the second evening, I cooked a small dinner and sat near the fire until the sun dipped low behind the ridge. The light turned that particular shade of blue-gray you only get in the mountains right before full dark. Fog began to gather near the tree line. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was a tree stump, just a dark shape near the birches, maybe 15 yards off. But as the light shifted, I could make out a human figure. Tall, thin, arms loose at his sides. He wasn't moving. Just standing there between two birch trunks, no gear, no flashlight, just... Still, I called out, "Hey, you okay?" No answer. I stood and took a few cautious steps forward. He didn't move. But when I got within maybe 10 yards, he started walking. Not forward, not sideways. Backwards, and straight into the trees. Not once did he turn. He moved slow. Like he wasn't in a hurry but knew I was coming. I jogged forward, crossed the space where he'd been standing. I expected to hear him crashing through brush, but there was no sound. And then I realized something that stopped me cold. The ground where he had stood, the wet leaves, the soft moss, was untouched. No prints. No scuff marks, just mine. I looked around for boot tracks, for anything out of place, but there was nothing. Like he had never touched the ground at all. I didn't sleep much that night, and I didn't light another fire. The next morning I packed up slowly. The forest felt different, heavier somehow. Like the trees were leaning in just a little more, the birches especially. They creaked now and then, but there was no wind. I kept thinking about the man, about how he'd walked backward without looking, about the way he just stood there like he'd been waiting for something. I hiked toward where I'd seen him vanish. Not far, just a few hundred feet into the woods, I didn't find him, but I did find a pattern. There were more birch trees, a line of them, almost perfectly spaced. Every 20 or 30 feet, like someone had planted them intentionally. Among the pines and oaks, they stood out, bone white against darker trunks, and in front of one, maybe the sixth in the line, there was a piece of cloth. Torn maybe from a jacket. Damp and dirty, I picked it up. Smelled it, sweat and mildew. Old, I found a tree nearby with a faint carving in the bark. Not fresh, more like something half-healed over the years. Looked like letters, maybe a name. I could make out E.S., but the rest was warped. The more I stood there, the more the space began to feel wrong. Like the forest around the birches was quiet in a different way. Not silent, but held. Like sound didn't want to stay. I went back to camp, packed faster, didn't eat. The hike out felt longer. I kept checking over my shoulder. The shadows were thin, stretched between the trees like thread. When I got back to the car, there was a man standing by the driver's side door. Older, maybe in his 60s. Ranger vest, he nodded as I approached. "You were down the East Fire Spur?" he asked. I nodded. "Camped near the birch line?" I said yes. He looked away for a second. Picked at the corner of a nail. "Should have blocked that turnoff," he muttered. Then he looked at me again, more directly. "You didn't follow them, did you?" I didn't know how to answer that. He nodded like I had. "You're lucky," he said, and turned to walk down the road. Didn't say goodbye, I left. Drove straight back to Boone, then to Asheville, then home. That was 6 months ago. Sometimes I still wake up, thinking I see a man standing between the trees, in my backyard and just still, waiting. But I don't go look because I remember what it felt like. That space, where the ground stays undisturbed, like someone was there but never really walked in. I keep a little handheld voice recorder in my chest pocket when I hike. Nothing fancy, just a cheap digital model I bought years ago to help with trail journaling. I don't do YouTube or trip reports or any of that. It's more for myself, a way to mark what I saw, what I felt, so the memories don't dissolve into just another blur of pines and rock and sweat. This trip started like most of mine do. Alone. Mid-October, sky still holding that bruised color from the season shift. The trail I picked ran off an old Forest Service road near Laurel Gap, not far from the Tennessee line. Not marked well, but I'd pieced the route together from an old ranger station map and some handwritten directions I found on a backpacking forum. I'd planned for 2 nights out, just a loop up over the ridge, down along the hollow, then back out through an old logging cut. Quiet country, barely used. The kind of trail where you start to forget what pavement even looks like. The kind of trail that narrows the longer you walk it until it's just you, the trees, and a thin line of worn earth beneath your boots. The first night I made camp just shy of the ridgeline. The forest opened slightly into a small shelf of ground, mossy and uneven, littered with wind-fallen branches. The light died early behind the ridge. I remember that, how the sun seemed to disappear faster than it should have. Before dinner, I recorded a short log. I always do. Timestamp, trail conditions, elevation, what I saw. The usual. Nothing weird. The wind was still, the fire crackled, and the only sound aside from my own voice was the distant hiss of a stream down in the valley, or so I thought. I didn't listen to the recording until I got home. It was a week later. I've been meaning to go through the audio and write out the details for my own records. I don't usually listen back closely, just skim, get the facts. But this time something felt off. About 3 minutes into the clip from the first night, I paused. I'd been talking about the temperature dropping fast, how I'd set up camp just before losing the light. But layered beneath my voice, subtle but definitely there, and was something else. A breath, then another, whispered, breathy syllables, almost like someone exhaling words right next to the mic. At first I assumed it was wind, maybe some rustling. Audio pareidolia. But the recorder had been zipped into my chest pocket the whole time. There shouldn't have been any ambient whispers. And then, right at the end of the clip, it came through clear, unmistakable. "You walked over her grave." The words were slow, drawn out like they were pulled from the back of a throat. I sat there staring at my computer, waiting for something else to follow. But the clip just ended. Silence. I replayed it, again and again. Even tried isolating the frequency. Nothing altered the clarity of it. Those same words tucked just beneath my voice like they'd always been there. I checked the other clips. The one from the following morning and normal. My voice, the sound of my boots on wet leaves, distant crows. Nothing strange. But that night's recording, it changed things. I pulled out the trail map. Tried to trace exactly where I'd camped that first night. The shelf of land hadn't been marked, but I found a note scribbled in pencil near the margin. No clear trail past gap. Stay high. I hadn't stayed high. I'd dipped down into the hollow, that soft shelf where the moss clung thick to the stone, where the trees grew too close together and the ground smelled like old water and rot. I remembered something else then. Not a sound, but a texture. When I'd walked that area, my boots had sunk deeper than usual. Not mud, not leaves. Something else. Like the ground had been disturbed before. The next morning before I left, I'd noticed an old piece of rebar sticking out of the dirt near my fire pit, bent at a strange angle. I'd thought it was debris. Now I wasn't so sure. The next week I drove back. Not to hike. Just to check. I parked in the same spot, followed my own GPS trail until I reached that shelf again. It looked different. Not more overgrown, just heavier somehow. Like the moss had grown thicker in my absence. I stood there a long time, listening. The forest was quiet, no birds, no water. Just that thick mountain silence that feels like it presses inward behind your ears. I didn't find a grave, no headstone, no marker, but I found something. A ring of stones, old, sunken, covered in years of leaf rot. Perfectly shaped, like the kind you'd find on a pioneer burial. Small, waist height, the kind you forget about until someone steps too close. I didn't disturb it, didn't say anything, just turned and left. Back home, I deleted the clip from my computer, but the recorder still has it and saved in the internal memory. I haven't played it again, but I can't bring myself to erase it either. Sometimes I think about that voice, about how it didn't sound angry, just tired, like it had been repeating that phrase for years, waiting for someone to finally hear it. I wasn't new to camping. Grew up in Roan Mountain, hiked all over the Appalachians, from Cades Cove to Klingman's to stretches no one bothers naming. But this was the first time I'd camped near Millstone Ridge. My friend Caleb had picked the spot. Said it was quiet, remote, and only known to hunters and forestry guys. No service, no lights, just deep, hollow silence. That was the draw. We needed a break. Both of us had been worn thin. Him from divorce, me from trying to outrun mine. We parked at the end of a narrow gravel pull-off, then hiked a good hour through wet underbrush until we found a natural rise just above a drainage cut. A shoulder of earth ringed by thin trees, mostly pine and a few leaning birch. Fog hung low even at midday. Everything smelled like old wood and cold stone. That Appalachian rot that gets into your skin. We set camp just before dark. Tarp up, tent staked. The forest was still. No breeze, no crickets, just the occasional groan of trunks adjusting to weight. We ate by headlamp. Talked less than usual. There was something about the space, the weight of it, that made conversation feel out of place. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the zipper shifting. Caleb was sitting up. "You see that?" he whispered. Through the mesh, I spotted it. A light bobbing low between the trees downslope. Pale and rhythmic, like someone walking slowly with a flashlight. It didn't flicker like a campfire. It moved deliberate, left, then paused. Then again, like it was searching. We watched for a few seconds before Caleb unzipped and called out, "Hello?" The light stopped, no answer. Then it clicked off, not dimmed. Not walked away, just gone. We waited, maybe 30 seconds passed. Then it blinked on again, this time closer, maybe 20 feet from where it had last been. Still no voice. No footfalls. I called out too, nothing. Then silence. I don't know how long we sat watching. Maybe an hour. The light never returned. Eventually, we lay back down, but neither of us slept. The woods felt suspended, like something was holding its breath. By morning, the fog hadn't lifted. Dew hung heavy on the fly. Caleb was already out, crouched at the edge of the tree line. "I found it," he said. About 15 feet into the woods, half buried in moss and leaf litter, was an old metal lantern. Not a modern flashlight. The kind with a thick glass dome, rusted handle, and heavy iron base. The bulb inside was shattered. The wiring looked rotted, like it hadn't worked in years, but the moss under it was disturbed, like someone had placed it there recently. The soil was darker, freshly pressed. Neither of us touched it. We just stood there staring. Something about it felt wrong. Not just old, wrong. We didn't pack up right away. I think we both wanted to prove something to ourselves. That we weren't scared, that it was explainable. An old lantern doesn't mean anything, not really. The light could have come from a hunter, someone walking a ridge path in the dark. But neither of us said that out loud. We spent the day looping the area, trying to find signs of a campsite. A trail, footprints, anything. There was nothing. No tire tracks at the trailhead, no cleared fire rings, no trash, not even wrappers or cigarette butts. Just forest. Damp, dense, undisturbed. At one point, I followed a ridgeline west and found the remains of a barbed wire fence, sagging, rusted through, barely knee-high now. Beyond it was an overgrown patch of land that didn't feel like trail. It felt kept, unnaturally flat, choked with moss and brambles, but too orderly for the surrounding woods. I saw stones arranged in a crooked rectangle, knee-height, no markings. When I returned, Caleb asked if I'd seen the other one. What other one? He took me back to the edge of our site, maybe 10 feet from the tent, pointed to the base of a leaning poplar. Another lantern, smaller, squat, same style. Bulb cracked clean. It hadn't been there the night before. We were sure of it. We'd sat right near that spot, watched the trees, drank our coffee. There was no lantern there. It sat like it had grown from the soil. No dirt piled on top, but no forest litter on it either. Just placed. I tried to laugh. Someone's messing with us, but I didn't believe it. Not really, because we would have heard something. Footsteps, branches breaking. These woods carry every sound. But there had been nothing. That evening, Caleb suggested we leave. Just walk out and drive back to Boone before dark. We didn't. I wish we had. Around 9 p.m., while we were sitting in silence near the fire, the light returned. Not far off this time, just at the edge of the trees. It didn't sway. Didn't move, it just hung there low to the ground still. Neither of us spoke. Caleb slowly reached for his headlamp, but the moment he flicked it on, the light disappeared. We rushed toward it. There was no one, just another lantern. This one still warm to the touch. That broke something in us. We packed in silence, fast, stumbling through gear. Didn't bother rolling the tent, just stuffed it. We didn't speak the entire hike out. Only the sound of boots in mud, breath clouding in the cold. I never asked Caleb what he thought it was. He never asked me either. But we haven't camped together since. That was nearly a year ago. I still hike. Still head into the woods alone sometimes. But I've never gone back to Millstone Ridge. And every so often, usually on quiet nights when the power's out or the fog clings to the yard, I find myself thinking about that light. How it knew exactly where we were, how it kept getting closer, and how whatever carried it never once made a sound. I'd camped off and on for most of my adult life, but this trip was different. Me and my younger brother Shane had both needed space. Him from a job that was slowly grinding him down. Me from a breakup I still couldn't talk about without clenching my jaw. So we picked somewhere far out, past Elizabethton, past where the Forest Service even bothers to update the maps. It was a pull-off near an old overlook, tucked off a steep gravel road that looked like it hadn't been maintained since the 90s. One of those places where the air gets colder the higher you climb, and the trees don't look quite right when they move. We hiked in about a quarter mile from where we left the truck, into a clearing that jutted out above the valley. The kind of place locals probably used for bonfires back in the day. No cell signal, no light pollution, just mist clinging to the slope and a long drop into the hollow below. There were no other vehicles at the trailhead. No footprints on the trail but ours. We pitched the tent a few feet from the drop on flat ground ringed by broken stumps and rocks. There was a stone fire ring already built, black with old soot, looked unused for years. We didn't bring firewood, just a small burner for coffee and some freeze-dried stuff. That night we sat in camp chairs and didn't talk much. Just listened to the sounds of the ridge, the low groan of wind between trees, the occasional snapping limb deeper in the woods. I remember how still the valley was. Even the crickets seemed hesitant. We crawled into the tent around 11, slept light, the kind of sleep that only settles in pieces when you're too far from help for real comfort. But in the morning, something had changed. 30 feet away from our tent, just outside the tree line, a second tent had been pitched. Same style, same color, identical even. At first I thought it was a prank, that maybe someone had followed us in late, maybe some hiker we didn't see. But there were no boot prints, no gear outside, no signs anyone had approached from any direction. The tent was zipped closed. Shane stood behind me as I opened it. Inside, nothing. No sleeping bag, no pack, just the tent freshly staked, and one thing pinned to the inside wall, a torn scrap of brown paper. On it, written in shaky black ink, "Thanks for the firewood, that was it." Hadn't brought firewood, we didn't start a fire, we didn't even gather sticks. Felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the wind off the valley. We stood there a while, not saying anything. Eventually, Shane broke the silence. Maybe someone was here before us, came back to grab something, but the ground around the second tent was untouched. Not even the needle bed of pine was disturbed. It was like the thing had been placed from above, perfectly centered, without a trace. We checked the trail. No prints. No drag marks, nothing. Just a damp slope and our own 2 sets of boot tracks. We broke down our tent without saying a word. Neither of us wanted to stay another night. I tossed the burner in my pack half open and didn't even check to see if we'd left trash. But as we were leaving, about halfway back to the trailhead, Shane froze. "You hear that?" We listened. Somewhere downslope through the trees, faint maybe 100 yards off, was the sound of splitting wood, not snapping branches. Not animals. Deliberate cracks. Rhythm like someone chopping kindling. Then it stopped. We stood still for maybe 2 minutes, ears straining. Then, a quiet thump, like a log dropped onto damp ground. I wanted to call out, but my throat felt tight. We left fast. No stopping for water, just pushed until we saw the tailgate of the truck glinting through the trees like a lifeline. At the truck, we found a single piece of wood leaned up against the front tire. Birch, freshly cut. Wet at the center, balanced on top was our coffee pot. We hadn't even noticed it missing, no footprints. No sign of a vehicle pulling in after us, just the gift. Or maybe the reminder. Back home, I tried to shake it off. I told myself it had to be a backwoods hunter, maybe someone with a warped sense of humor. I even called the local ranger station to see if anyone else had logged a trip near Millstone Ridge that weekend. They said no. Said that trail wasn't technically even open anymore, said they stopped maintaining the overlook after a landslide. Years ago, cut the road in 2. I didn't ask more. Just said thank you and hung up. Shane doesn't camp anymore. Gave away his gear. Moved to Knoxville a few months later. He doesn't talk about the trip unless he's drunk, and even then it's short. Quiet. He always ends it with the same line. It was already there, man. That second tent when it was already waiting. As for me, I still hike. I still sleep in the woods sometimes. But never alone. And every time I set camp, I wake up at first light and do a sweep of the area. Just in case. Something's moved in while I was sleeping. Just in case someone else or something else is looking for shelter or firewood or a place to set up their tent, just close enough to yours where you'll be sure to see it. I was 2 days into a solo trip near Cherokee, the kind of primitive, unmaintained site you only find if you've been hiking the backcountry for years. No marked trailhead, no signs, just a Forest Service road that gives up halfway through the mountain and a narrow deer path that drops into a low hollow lined with pine and laurel. I'd found it years ago and kept coming back. It was the quiet I needed. No cars, no texts, just wind, creek water, and the stillness of damp moss under boot soles. This time I brought gear I usually left at home, a couple motion-triggered trail cams, a cheap sound recorder. Not for anything serious. I wasn't ghost hunting or chasing Bigfoot, just curious. Curious about what moved when I wasn't watching. The forest always feels fuller at night, like it breathes differently, and I thought it might be interesting to capture. What I never noticed, I set up camp in the usual spot, a shelf of dry ground above a slow-moving stream. The air smelled like wet needles and riverstone. I tied one cam to a birch facing the tent and placed the audio recorder on a rock just beyond the fire ring. I marked the time before I went to sleep, 9:41 p.m. I woke up sometime deep in the night, no dream. No sound, just awake. My chest felt tight, my stomach curled, like I'd been dropped suddenly from a height. Cold sweat under the sleeping bag. The air in the tent was freezing. I checked my watch, 13 a.m. I listened. Nothing, no wind, no insects, not even the creek. The kind of silence that feels thick, pressurized, like something was waiting just outside the fabric. I lay still for maybe an hour before the nausea faded and the cold eased off. Eventually, I drifted back into a shallow, twitchy sleep. In the morning, I forgot most of it, ate some oatmeal, packed up, and hiked out by noon. It wasn't until a week later that I checked the footage and audio. That's when it got strange. The camera footage showed nothing unusual. Squirrels. Some rain near midnight. A gust of wind shaking the pines just before 1 a.m. The tent didn't move. No people. No animals larger than a raccoon, but the audio was different. I loaded the file, scrubbed to the middle, and let it play as I folded laundry. It was mostly static, light wind, insects, until just past the 2-hour mark. 13 a.m. That's when it started. At first, I thought it was feedback. A high, faint tone, But then it shifted, wavered. It was a voice, a little girl's voice, humming, off-key, slow, childlike but not playful. More like someone trying to remember a tune they hadn't heard in years. It only lasted about 15 seconds. Then silence again. Not even the wind. I replayed it. The hum was shaky, uneven. Some of the notes quivered like the child was cold or crying. I couldn't place the melody. It wasn't a lullaby. Wasn't anything I recognized. I leaned in closer to the waveform. Just before the humming starts, there's the sound of pine needles shifting. Very faint, like something kneeling into them gently. I switched over to the trail cam. At 2:13 a.m., the timestamp showed my tent. Motionless, zipped up. No shadows, no movement. But in the bottom right corner of the frame, just barely in view, was a small indentation in the ground cover. Pressed down pine needles, roughly the size of a child's knees. No visible body. No motion trigger, just the faint impression like something was there just out of frame. I stared at it for hours, rewatched the footage, replayed the humming. Eventually, I muted the audio and stared at the still frame, the shape in the pine needles, the darkness behind it. I checked the weather log for that night. No frost, no wind gusts strong enough to press down anything. And I know how pine beds react to pressure. You step on them, they flatten. Slowly, deliberately. This wasn't scattered like fallen limbs. It was placed. I thought about that moment in the tent, the cold that came on so fast it woke me from a dead sleep. The nausea. The pressure in my chest, and now this. Something kneeling 10 feet from where I'd been sleeping. Silent. Watching. Or worse. Listening. I've gone back and forth a dozen times trying to rationalize it. Could have been a sound glitch. Could have been pareidolia. My brain assigning shape and pattern to static and shadows. But I don't think it was. Because the next night, after I saved the file and closed my laptop, I went to sleep with the window cracked. The trees outside my apartment were quiet. No cars, no wind. At 2:13 a.m., I woke up again, cold, and I could have sworn I heard humming. Faint, off-key. From somewhere below the window, I didn't move, didn't look, just lay there, listening.